This morning we're going to be actually looking through Leviticus 11 through 15. And these are laws basically referring to what is clean and what is unclean. And as we look through these chapters, we'll see that God, a holy God, requires that his people be holy as well. Not just morally and spiritually, but also physically. So God has made laws and things like that, rules, which basically are not only, they have a spiritual significance, but they're also to keep diseases and sicknesses and things like that out of his people. God was watching over them because, remember, because sin came into the world and the earth was now cursed, there are now these different diseases, these different things. And so the laws that we're going to see and, purifying and all these things that we're going to look at are really to help keep God's people pure, both physically and spiritually. And so that's what we're going to look at. And we're not going to spend a lot of time going verse by verse because I don't think it's necessary. It's just a matter of getting an overview of what these particular chapters are telling us. So in chapter 11, we have the dietary laws. All right, the dietary laws. And there is a reason that God, he separates between clean animals and unclean animals. What is allowed to be eaten, what is not allowed to be eaten. And as you look through the different kinds of animals that are clean or that are unclean, you find out that the unclean ones are more likely to be carrying things that would make people sick. For example, especially back then, swine, pigs would be carrying a certain disease that if it wasn't really cooked thoroughly, people could catch by eating it and so forth. And so, today we live in a day where, we have ovens, we have all these things. But back then, they didn't have the kind of equipment we have. They just had open fires to cook in and so forth. And if something wasn't quite done and there was still bacteria living in there from these animals, you could get sick from it. So in verses 1 through 8, he focuses on a four-footed beast. Notice it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which ye shall eat among all beasts that are on the earth." Okay, so now we're talking about the kind of things, the meat that we normally eat from land animals. And notice, in verse 3 really tells us, "Whatsoever parteth the hoof, and is cloven-footed, and cheweth the cud among the beasts, that shall ye eat." And then he goes on to name a bunch of animals and why they're not accepted. Some of them chew the cud, but they're not cloven-footed or whatever it is. But you had to have all three of those things. They had to part the hoof, they had to be cloven-footed, and they had to chew the cud. And if they met those three requirements, then you could eat them. But if they were missing even in one of those requirements, then they were considered unclean and you were not supposed to eat them. And again, so now remember, some of the laws, for example, later on he's going to talk about the fact that you're not supposed to have a garment that is made both of wool and of linen. And there are probably some practical shrinkage rates are different for different materials, and it could cause tears. Today we have blended materials and all these things, but back then they didn't. But there was also a spiritual significance for that, and that had to do with mixture. God didn't want mixture in his people, and he used clothing as an example of that. But we'll get to that at some point in the book. And so notice all others are unclean. So in this particular case, God just says, this is what is unclean, and if it doesn't fit this criteria, it's unclean. That's pretty simple. So it was very easy for people to check their animals whatever animal they may find, whatever beast they may kill. And if it didn't meet those requirements, there are people who like to eat certain meats that are unclean today. Well, we're not under the law anymore, so we can eat, pork, and we can eat things like that. We're not under this law, and the law, this was specifically for the nation of Israel. You'll notice, just because this is something that's brought up all the time, in verse 6, it mentions the hare. Now, we think of a hare as a large rabbit. Whatever that animal was probably extinct long ago. The Hebrew word, I think, comes out to be something like an arbanath or something like that. It is not the hare that we know of that grows up in England that gets really big and hops around and so forth. It's some kind of animal, because notice what it says, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof. So he has a hoof, but that can't be a rabbit then. So they substituted the word hare for an animal that they didn't really know what it named. So that was sort of the way they dealt with it. So it's not really a mistake. It's just that's the term they used for this animal that they don't know what it is because it was extinct. So some people try to say, well, that's a mistake in the Bible because it's the hare is some other animal and it doesn't have a hoof and it doesn't chew the cud, so that's a mistake in the. It's not a mistake. It's at that time that word hare is not the hare we presently know as hare. It's just the word they used to describe that particular animal. So notice in verse 8 though, of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch, they are unclean to you. So notice, any animal that is unclean, they're not even supposed to touch the carcasses of them. And so that's what God says. So God is separating his people from anything that is unclean. And spiritually speaking, we're supposed to do the same thing. We're now God's people. We're not under these dietary laws, but we are supposed to be able to distinguish between what is spiritually clean and what is spiritually unclean, and we're not supposed to touch it. Matter of fact, we're told, come out from among them and be ye separate in Corinthians, and what? Touch not the unclean thing. That's what God wants us to do. He wants us to be a clean people. I think we should be clean physically as well as spiritually as well. They used to say in Boy Scouts, cleanliness is next to godliness when I was in Boy Scouts. But as a matter of fact, in the oath, I will be, one of the words that they used, the things that a scout is supposed to be, one of them was clean. And so, but when it comes to God's people, we are to be clean. We should be clean physically, and and definitely spiritually. We should not be partaking of the world's uncleanness. And in many, many scriptures in the Bible, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. Touch not the unclean thing, as I said. That whole passage talks about what conquered is Christ with Belial and all the different things. We're to be separated from people. And that's really, other than, the physical reasons, the health reasons why God does this, it's also to show his people that they are to be a clean people spiritually. Then in verse 9 through 12, we have what we call seafood or water food that comes out of the water. So it could be sea, it could be fresh water as well. Notice, these shall ye eat of all that are in the waters. Whatsoever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the seas, and in the rivers, them shall ye eat. And all that have not fins and scales in the seas and in the rivers, of all that move in the waters, and of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. They shall be even as an abomination unto you. Ye shall not eat of their flesh, but ye shall have their carcasses in abomination. Whatsoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. Notice how very clear God is about these things. So that means if you like shrimp or scallops, you can have them. Or anything else, crab, lobster, all those were off the plate. The two requirements, fins and scales. And if it had fins and scale, both fins and scales, then you could eat it. And so this is pretty simple. But I notice now here, he adds the word, it shall be an abomination to you. You need to look at it as something that is abominable, that you disdain, that you want no part of. Why? Because you are to be a clean people. Now, as you know, most of these kinds of water animals, water beings, are usually bottom feeders and so forth. Many of them are fish that eat other fish, things like that. So what God is doing is he's trying to eliminate a lot of the things he's just basically telling them this is what you can eat and what you can't eat. He has his reasons, and some of it is health reasons, and some of it is just to distinguish. Sometimes, we could eat lobster today, and it's no problem, but it's a bottom feeder. It eats, other things that eat other animals. That's why, in the carnivorous animals as well, all the animals that you can eat are not carnivorous. They're all herbivores, I guess is the proper word for it. After the fish come the different kinds of birds. And these are they which ye have an abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle and the ossifrage and the offspring. Now, in this particular case, he doesn't give any particular features. He just begins to name all the unclean animals to them. And what is really the distinguishing factor about all these animals? They're either carnivorous birds or they have unclean habits, and therefore they are not to be eaten. And so that's why all the other fowls that are mentioned, chickens and turkeys, or they didn't have turkeys there, but things like that, they were allowed to be eaten. Pheasant, all those kind of things. But anything that was carnivorous or had some sort of unclean habit, God singles out and says you can't eat those. He even refers to the bat. And remember, when he's talking about fowl, he's basically talking about flying things, okay? Things that fly. And then in verse 20, he talks about flying insects. He refers to them as fowls too, but the fowl just has the idea of that they fly. All fowls that creep, going on all four, ye shall not eat, or shall be abominable unto you. Yet these may ye eat, of every flying, creeping thing that goeth upon all four, which have legs above their feet to leap withal upon the earth. Even these of them may ye eat, the locust after his kind, the bald locust after his kind, the beetle after his kind, the grasshopper after his kind. But all other flying, creeping things which have 4 feet shall be an abomination unto you. So the distinguishing factor about these, what we call insects that fly, were, do they leap? Like a locust or a grasshopper or something like that. So that was distinguishing factor. You say, well, why is he letting them eat? Now remember, what was John the Baptist's diet? Locusts and wild honey. Now, what I was reading somewhere, one of the places I was reading, and it was talking about the fact that when the locusts would come, and they would swarm and they would eat most of the crops so that you didn't have a harvest anymore, people knew how to not only, they could eat those locusts that just ate all their food, and they usually were in such large swarms that there was tons of them everywhere, but they also knew a way to cook them up somehow and preserve them for future eating. So the point here is that God has made a provision. If a famine comes into the land and God sends locusts or something like that into the land that devour their food, then the devourer becomes devoured himself, you might say. So in other words, God is providing a way, even though they're not going to have the bread or the crops that they thought they were going to have, they're still going to be taken care of. And so even when God sends punishment upon them, chastisement upon them for some sin, and he sends locusts or something like that among them, he also, in his mercy, has provided a way for them to still survive through that particular type of plague. Now I want to go to 29. Okay, well, actually, yeah, I'm going to skip over a few things because I'm going to come back to a couple things. So in verse 29, it says, "These also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the weasel and the mouse and the tortoise," and he goes on to talk about things like that. And then if you go down to verse 41, "And every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatsoever goeth upon the belly." So now we're talking about all sorts of things. We're talking about snakes. We're talking about mice. We're talking about rodents. We're talking about anything that creeps upon the earth. You know, who wants to find one of those centipedes running around and say, "Oh, I think I'll have that for lunch today"? Not too many people going to want to do that anyway, but it was still forbidden, and so we weren't supposed to do it. So basically, any creeping thing, anything, you know, those types of bugs, other than the insects that were just named, that have wings and that can leap, they were to be eaten. But any other creeping thing, whether it's of any kind of animal, whether it's a snake or eel or whatever it is, they were not to be eaten. Okay? So all of those creeping things and all of the vermin, as we might call them, are not to be eaten. In verse 24 it says, "For these shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until the even. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be clean unto the even." So now notice even this: "The carcass of every beast which divideth the hoof, and is not cloven-footed, or cheweth the cud, are unclean unto you. Every one that toucheth them shall be unclean. And whatsoever goeth upon his paws among all manner of beasts that go on all four, those are unclean unto you. Whoso toucheth their carcass shall be unclean until the even. He that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the even. They are unclean unto you." So God is making it very clear that not only are you not to eat them, you're not even supposed to touch them if they're dead. Now, what's a good example of a beast with paws that was unclean, that shouldn't have been touched, that was? That would be Samson, right? Yep, I heard something back there. I couldn't distinguish it. But the lion, right, he said a lion. That's right, there was a lion that was torn by Samson, which was fine. He was defending himself then. But when he went back later and he found honey in the carcass, he should not have touched it. And he was a Nazirite, so he should have known better. But he was so proud of what he had done, and he saw that honey in there that he took it. Not only did he defile himself, he gave it to his parents. And they unknowingly ate of something that was unclean. But God says don't. Why? Because that's what God said. And because that's what he said. And then in verse 31, it says, "All these are unclean to you, among all that creep. Whosoever toucheth them, when they be dead, shall be unclean until the even. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, doth fall, it shall be unclean." So you're out there with your fly swatter, and you swat a fly, and it falls into your dish. Now your dish is unclean. Okay? Or anything. It falls on the windowsill. Now the windowsill's unclean. Whatever, anything that it falls on, any of these animals, once they're dead, anything that it touches, it defiles. Now this is, by the way, all a picture of the curse and the defilement of sin. I mean, a lot of these creeping things, you know, mice, and what are they? They're just things that carry disease, many of them. You know, flies, they go on anything. And, you know, they'll go from the dung heap to your plate, and they don't care. That's why they're unclean. And they carry all sorts of diseases. with them sometimes. And so God is protecting his people, but he's also trying to show them that whatsoever is unclean in the sight of God is to be had in abomination. And that includes not just the physical now, but in the spiritual realm as well. And so he goes on talking about if it falls on a vessel or a raiment or a skin or a sack, anything. And then what do? You have to wash it. It must be put in water and shall be unclean until the even. So it shall be cleansed, it says in verse 32. And so now if something defiles something, there's a way it needs to be washed, probably hung out to dry. You would think once you wash something, you're going to dry it up. And usually that would be hanging out in the sun. And then it would, then the next day, it would be clean again. And so there was a time for whatever defilement was on it, it had to be washed off and then left to dry before it could be considered clean again. It talks about earthen vessels. And he says if there's an earthen vessel and these things go in it, you break it. You don't use it again. But if it's a vessel like of metal, an iron or brass or something like that, then it needs to be scoured and cleaned, and then the next day it could be used again. But the earthen vessels, God said, you just break it. God, in the second Psalm it says, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. The vessels that are unclean will be broken one day. And so here we see a picture of that as well. The fact that an earthen vessel that is unclean to God will be broken. Now, there are two ways to be broken. Remember, the Bible talks about those who come to the rock and fall upon it, they shall be broken. But if the rock falls upon them, they shall be ground into powder. So there are two ways for that vessel to be broken, spiritually speaking today. A human vessel comes to God, and either he is broken, spiritually he's broken, and he confesses his sin to God, he's broken, and God gives him new life, or he remains in his sin, and eventually God will grind him to powder, as the figure is there. In other words, they'll be broken, but it'll be too late to be fixed again. And then, if we go down to verse 44, and again, there's a lot of other things in here. It just talks about, for example, if there is sowing seed that's going out and something falls on that's dead, it'll be unclean. It'll be clean unless it's watered. So in other words, if an animal falls into your sack of sowing feed and it's dead, you can get it out of there, and as long as it's never been watered, it's okay. But if it gets watered while that animal's on there, then it's no good. So, and again, and other things like that. So in verse 44, for I am the Lord your God, ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. For I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beast and of the fowl, and of every living creature that moveth in the waters, and of every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, and between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. So notice this is the law of holiness. Now remember, Peter quotes, be ye holy, for I am holy, in the New Testament, referring to us not keeping these laws, but being a clean people spiritually in this present evil world. And the thing is, Israel was going to move in a land that had been defiled by the inhabitants that were there. The Canaanites were some of the most unclean people to ever live. Matter of fact, when it said, cursed be Canaan, remember Canaan, the son of Ham? People like to talk about the curse of Ham. It doesn't say the curse of Ham. It doesn't say cursed be Ham. It says cursed be Canaan. Why? Because the line that proceeded from Canaan was going to be a line that was going to become so unclean that God would say, we need to wipe them off the face of the earth. And when he sent Israel in there, that's exactly what he told them to do. That they were not supposed to make any kind of alliance with them. They were to kill everyone, man, woman, children, everything. And in some cases, they weren't even allowed to take their beasts. Everything was to be gotten rid of. Why? Because it was all unclean in the sight of God. Because of spiritually, they were an unclean people. And their practices were pretty unclean too. And I won't get into that today. But God wants to distinguish his people from other people. He wants his people to be a holy people, and he wants there to be such a difference between them and the rest of the world that when they see the laws of Israel and the way that they are keeping, and the fact that because of their obeying God and keeping these laws, they don't have all these diseases that everyone else has and so forth. It's to be a testimony of the grace of God upon his people, and they are supposed to be a testimony to the rest of the world. And remember this, that God says if any stranger wants to move into the land and he wants to be circumcised, he is to be treated just like he was born in the land. He was one of them. So what God really wants is for these people to be a testimony that would draw other people to himself. Then we get into chapter 12. Chapter 12 is a law basically for mothers who give birth. In verses 1 through 4, it says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a woman have conceived seed and born a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. According to the days of the separation for her infirmity shall she be unclean. And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purifying 33 days. She shall touch no hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying be fulfilled. So if she has a man-child, there's 7 days, and then there's another 33 days for a total of 40 days that she's considered unclean. Okay? And then on the 8th day, she is to they are to have that child circumcised. Now, remember, circumcision goes back to Abraham, and then they're told that it's to be on the 8th day. And there's reasons for that as well, because I've read about this as well, that after 7 days, the immune system of an infant has kicked in. But they really don't feel any pain, at least not in that area where they're going to be circumcised. So it's actually the perfect time. God set it so that if a child is circumcised on the 8th day, that it's a safe thing to do. And it's also a sign of the covenant. And remember this, a child that was not circumcised was to be cut off from among his people. But a child can't stand up and say, hey, remember to circumcise me, obviously. So what does this mean? That the parents have to do due diligence to make sure that they follow the law. And so they're considered, so basically 7 days and 30, so 40 days she's unclean. So she's not to be with her husband during that time, intimately anymore for that period of time. And she's considered unclean while she's recovering from this birth. In verse 5, it says, But if she bear a maid child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her separation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying 66 days. So the time doubles if it's a little girl. You say, well, why is that? Well, God doesn't tell us why. He just says that's the way it is, and so that's the way it is. And so I don't know why. I suppose there are some people who have speculated about it, but since it doesn't give us a clear, except that God is distinguished, perhaps because the man was first, and then the woman was made to be the helpmeet. Maybe because Eve was deceived. There's all sorts of things you could probably speculate about. All I can say is God said so, and so just do it. And sometimes we just need to obey God and not question him. But the time doubled for if it was a girl. And that's all we really need to say about that. And then, starting in verse 6, he talks about the law or the offering of purification. And it says, and when the days of her purifying are fulfilled for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring a lamb of the first year for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation unto the priest, who shall offer it before the Lord and make an atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from her issue of blood. This is the law for her that hath borne a male or a female. And if she not be able to bring a lamb, then she shall bring 2 turtles or 2 young pigeons, the one for the burnt offering and the other for the sin offering, and the priest shall make an atonement for her, and she shall be clean. So notice, now a sin offering is to be made, and then a burnt offering is to be made after this child goes in, so that the mother is judicially cleansed and can go back to her regular life again. And notice, God makes an exception. He says, I want a lamb, and then I want a turtle dove or a pigeon. But if they can't afford that lamb, then they can just go ahead and bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And so he's not making it out of reach for people who don't have the same kind of means, don't have a lamb, and so forth. Now, why does they have to go through these purifyings? Well, let's turn over to Psalms 59 and verse 3. That is not right. It should be 58. I'm sorry, I must have mistyped that. It's 58, verse 3, where it says, the wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. What is he talking about there? Well, let's look at another verse, and then I'll explain it a little bit better. Psalm 51 and verse 5. Where it says, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, there are some people who say, well, the act of procreation is sinful. No, if under the right conditions of a husband and wife, of course, it's not sinful. God made it that way. It's not talking about that. What is it talking? It says, basically, what it's saying is that a child is shapen in iniquity. In other words, he's born with a sin nature, he or she. And you can see it because they're estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. What is more selfish than an infant? Now, he doesn't know any better. He's come into this world, and all he knows is his own needs. He knows he's hungry. He knows he's uncomfortable. He knows he's lonely. He knows he wants his mother's comfort, whatever. And what does he do? He cries or makes a ruckus until he gets what he wants. Now, that's all he knows. But it's just a sign of the sin nature. In nature, you don't see a lot of other animals who are the same way. Some of them are, but some of them. Matter of fact, there are some animals, they lay their eggs, and that's it. The thing hatches, and it's on its own. And so forth. But we are shapen in iniquity. In other words, we're born with a sin nature. And we are defiled. And in the childbearing process, you notice it talks about being purified from her blood, it mentioned in our text. There's blood involved in that, in the childbirthing process and so forth. And so all of this is defiling, and therefore, spiritually speaking, there's this whole ritual that they go through of bringing these offerings and waiting this certain amount of time to show that there's a defilement that comes with birth because we're born with that old sin nature, and that we need a sin offering in order to cleanse us from our sin, and a burnt offering so that we can walk with God for the rest of our life. Because as we've talked about, the burnt offering is our dedicating our lives and living for God. Okay. Now in chapters 13 and 14 are the laws of leprosy, concerning leprosy. And again, I'm not going to read through all of these, but as you read through well, first of all, I want you to notice, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, or a bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy." Okay. "Then shall he be brought unto Aaron the priest, or unto one of his sons the priests, and the priest shall look on the plague." So I want you to notice, first of all, the role of the priest in all this. In Israel, it was the priesthood that was to look over the people and to determine whether this ailment, this thing that was in the skin, was really a leprosy or not. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to notice. But I want you to note, as you look through it, it talks about bright spots or scabs. It talks about a plague in the skin of the flesh where the hair is plagued and it is turned white, and the plague is be deeper than the skin. And then later on it talks about a bright spot, and it talks about all these different things. When he's talking about a leprosy, it's talking about a disease in the skin and not specifically what we refer to as leprosy today. There's a specific, I forget what the name of it is now, but there's a specific thing. When we talk about leprosy, it's this particular plague. But back then, any kind of ailment that rose up on someone's flesh, a spot or anything like that, was potentially a leprosy. And so what the priest was supposed to do is, first of all, they would look. They would see, oh, gee, I have this scab growing here, or this rash growing here, or this weird-looking bright spot, or whatever it may be, or some like a canker sore, or whatever it was, and they were to go to the priest. And the priest was to look upon it, and then he was supposed to go through certain tests. And again, I'm not going to read through all this, but they were to be put apart 7 days, and then they were supposed to go back to the priest. They were shut up during that time. They weren't allowed to have contact with anybody else. And anything that they touched during that time was considered unclean, and it needed to be, washed. And if, the wife went in to her husband and she touched him while he was unclean, then she was unclean. She had to wash herself and be unclean till the even, and then she'd be all right for the next day. All these kinds of things. But they were to test it. They were to go through some rigorous testing. And it would usually be a 7-day period. And then if there was no change, there was supposed to be a second 7-day period. And if it began to heal, then they were considered clean. If it continued to get worse, they were considered unclean. And there may be a third week where they'd finally go to see how it went. And if it was continually going that way, and it was getting worse, then they were considered unclean and they were to be put out. They weren't allowed to be among God's people anymore. Okay? And so really you have, now, and again, there are some times where it talks about, they have this, rash or something going on, but the skin is not broken. It's just some sort of a rash. They were considered clean. Even if it was some sort of plague that turned their skin white, they were considered clean. Remember Naaman the leper? He was all white. He was still allowed to go among people. Why? Because there was no open wound in it. There was no scab. There was no anything that would cause it to be infectious, even though he was a Syrian. That's why when Naaman got his leprosy, not Naaman, Gehazi got his leprosy afterwards, he was later seen sitting there talking to the king when that woman came back, and I don't want to turn there and go there, but there was an instance where this man was given the leprosy of another man, but he was still allowed to be among people. He still had this ailment in his skin, but he was not considered unclean because there was no open wound in that leprosy, that form of leprosy. Now, some of these things have been described as, chicken pox, measles, other things like that people might get. and then right down to what we would call leprosy today. So there were all sorts of different things, and as you read through, it talks about boils, things breaking out in boils. What is God having them look for? Anything that might be contagious, that might spread among God's people. And once you found this skin ailment that was contagious, and you realized that that was the problem, then that person was separated. They were to have no contact. And what happened when they did that? Well, one thing God says is once they were put out, if they were out and about and there were some people coming toward them, they had to hold up their hand above their lip and say, "Unclean, unclean," so that people wouldn't come too close, so that they would know that there was a leper there. He was contagious. Don't go near him or you could become a leper yourself. And so there were all sorts of laws about that. Okay. And then let's see. This goes all the way down to verse 46, that it talks about all these things. So it's any man or woman who has any kind of ailment like this in their flesh, they are to be tested, and if it's God's given the priest everything that he needs to look for, and if it meets certain requirements, they're considered unclean. They're to be put out from among God's people. Without the camp shall his habitation be, it says at the end of verse 46. Now in verse 47 to the end of the chapter, it talks about a plague of leprosy that be in a garment, a woolen garment, a linen garment, wherever it might be. Probably this is talking maybe about some sort of mold or something that might get into a garment. It's called a leprosy because it's something that you can see physically. And they're basically told that it's to be washed a certain way. If it goes away, okay, then it can be clean again. If that spot that has it, they would tear that piece of the garment out, and then they could probably put a new piece in it if it was considered clean. But then it was to be washed, and if the leprosy came back again, whatever it was, whether it was some sort of mold or fungus that got into the clothing, then it was to be actually destroyed at some point, if it's a fretting leprosy, as it's called in verse 52. And so, in other words, you can't get rid of it. It can't be washed out. You can't cut it out and just put a new thing. It's in there. You can't get rid of it. That garment is defiled. It is to be burned. It is to be gotten rid of. So notice, they are to be a clean people, and those who have some sort of physical uncleanness are to be separated from among his people. Now the garments that have anything in it that is unclean is to be gotten rid of and separated, either cleansed or separated. And then in chapter 14, we have the offerings. And verses 1 through 32, it talks about if someone is cleansed of his leprosy. Now, the kind of leprosy we refer to as leprosy today has no cure. But some of these other things that they mentioned, like chicken pox or things like that, eventually you can be healed from. And they're no longer contagious. So when you realize, hey, this thing that I have, it's gone now, then what are you supposed to do? You are to go to the priest, and he looks at you, and he says, okay, it looks like it's gone. We're going to shut you up for 7 days, and we're going to test you again, and maybe they do that twice, I think. And then what happens? You're considered unclean, and now you are to bring an offering to the Lord. Was that? Yeah, they're not clean until they make the offering. So in other words, they no longer have this, and so technically they're clean, but judicially they're not clean until they bring the offering. So notice it says, then shall the priest command to take for him, this shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought unto the priest, and the priest shall go forth out of the camp, and the priest shall look and behold if the plague of leprosy be healed in the leper. So notice there must be some sort of record about what kind of leprosy that person had, so that the priest knows when this person comes back and says, hey, I'm healed, he can look at him and knows what to test for. Okay? Then shall the priest command to take for him, that is to be cleansed, 2 birds alive and clean, and cedar wood and scarlet and hyssop. And the priest shall command that one of the birds be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. Isn't that interesting? In an earthen vessel over running water. And notice, I think about the fact that he's killed, and it's the running water speaks of the flow. We talked about the flow of the blood of Calvary sometimes and so forth, but it's always under running water. And by the way, running water is an important part of the Jewish culture. You come and wash up in a basin, and after the first person washes up, what does he leave behind in the basin? His dirt and his germs. And then the next person comes and he leaves more. But some of the germs from the first guy is probably staying on that second guy. And now the next guy, he's got even more germs to deal with and so forth. They didn't know about germs back then. But what did God do? He said, I want you to use running water and not just a basin or something else. So they killed the first one. And as for the living bird, he shall take it, and the cedar wood and the scarlet and the hyssop, and dip them in the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water, and he shall sprinkle upon him that is to be cleansed from the leprosy 7 times, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose into the open field. And he that is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair from his whole body, that is, and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. And after that shall he come into the camp, and shall tarry abroad out of his tent 7 days. But it shall be on the 7th day that he shall shave all his hair off his head, and his beard, and his eyebrows, even all his hair he shall shave off. And he shall wash his clothes also. Also he shall wash his flesh in water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 he lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb of the first year without blemish, and 3/10 deals of fine flour for a meat offering mingled with oil, and 1 log of oil. And the priest shall that maketh him clean shall present the man that is to be made clean, and those things before and he makes these sacrifices for the man. I won't keep reading here, but notice the extensiveness of this. Not only is he come back and to be tested, but now he's to go wash his clothes, shave all the hair off of his body, because those germs could be, caught up in his hair somewhere. Hair is one of the germiest things on your body, by the way, if you didn't know that. And then he is to stay out of his tent. He's allowed nearby. He's not outside the camp anymore, but a special place is made for him where he's going to live for 7 days. And then at the end of that 7 days, he's going to shave all the hair off his body. He's going to wash his clothes. He's going to take a bath. He's going to get himself clean. And then he's going to go, and the priest is going to check him one more time. And then if nothing has come back, then he makes this offering for him. And there's a sin offering, a burnt offering, and all the other things that he makes that judicially means that he is clean, and now he can go back in his family, and there's no problem anymore. Okay? And then, of course, as you know, just like with the women who gave birth, if he can't bring the lambs, then God has other options for him, for the poorer person. And but that it still means he has to make some sort of an offering. And all this is a picture. And as we're going to see, we'll mention later on, but I'll mention it here. Leprosy is a picture of sin and the defilement of sin. And so all this being put out because of being defiled and all this, once you've been pronounced clean, there's an offering to be made and you're to be washed, and all this is a picture of everything that Christ has done for us to deliver us from the defilement of sin. And then, starting in verse 33, and down to verse 53, you have, if there is a leprosy in a house, or some sort of a plague. And now what is that talking? Probably talking about mold and mildew that might grow in a house, something like that. Some sort of something that gets into the woodwork or into the thatching of your house or something like that, and it begins to grow, and it's probably, like I said, mold, mildew, things like that, that will make you sick if you live in it. And it's very true. I mean, if you live in a very moldy house, you're going to get sick. It's just going to happen. And so that's why you need to keep your house clean. If you have a flood in your basement, they even have professionals who come in and can clean all that stuff out of your basement and stuff, because it's really bad and it's very unhealthy to live in. And so anyway, it talks about, basically it goes through what they're supposed to do. At one point, they're to scrape the house. And if that takes care of it after a certain amount of time, then it's considered clean. If it keeps coming back, they may take a piece of the whole house out and rebuild that. And then if it comes back again, they're supposed to tear down the whole house. And the house is to be, taken down. You have to build a new house. And so, in other words, all the different things that are being done are basically being done to keep God's people clean and in a clean environment. And then from verse 54 to the end, we have a summary of all the chapters we have just been reading. This is the law for all manner of plague, of leprosy and scall, and for the leprosy of a garment of a house, for the rising, and for a scab, and for a bright spot, to teach when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law of leprosy. Now, notice how there is the priest who is responsible for all this, who is to determine whether it's clean or unclean, and the laws, of course, that go with it that help them to do that. And then, so what is God doing? First of all, he wants them to be a clean people. But he also doesn't want them to panic every time somebody gets a little sore on them. Because all of a sudden somebody, get a little rash or something like that, and everybody's going to say, oh, he's unclean, throw him out. No, there was an orderly way of dealing with these things so that the people were safe and clean, and if somebody really wasn't contagious, then they weren't thrown out just because they had this thing on them. And of course, whether it's the garments or whether it's the house or whatever it is, all these things were intended to help God's people be clean. In chapter 15, it talks about various types of uncleanness. When there's an issue of blood or some other, oozing in man's flesh, and a lot of it has to do with the uncleanness of men. And that's the first 18 verses. And then 19 through 30 talks about specific about uncleanness in women, which happens periodically. And that they're unclean during that particular time, and so forth. And I don't need to read through all of that. And then in verses 31 to 33, it says, thus shall ye separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, that they die not in their uncleanness, when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. This is the law of him that hath an issue, of him whose seed goeth from him, and is defiled therewith, of her that is sick of her flowers, and of him that hath an issue of the man and of the woman, and of him that lieth with her that is unclean. And so if you have contact with a person who has one of these issues, you're considered unclean. And then, of course, God, what is God? Again, God is trying to keep his people clean and undefiled. As I said at the beginning, most of these laws are to prevent sickness or to keep some sort of sickness or something from spreading. They're also to separate Israel from other nations that didn't practice these things. But mainly, for us today, they symbolize the need for God's people to be holy in all areas of our life. We are to be a holy people because God, wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will be a father unto you, and so forth. And so God wants his people to be separated and to be a clean people. And that's really what these several chapters we've looked at is trying to convey to us today.